The United States under attack. 3 hijacked planes crash into the heart of American power. 2 rip through the twin towers of the World Trade Center. The devastation after both towers collapse, the extent of casualties is still unclear. Then in Washington, another plane crashes into a defense building at the Pentagon. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. Heavy loss of life and catastrophic destruction. That's the scene on the streets of New York after the United States suffers what many are saying is the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. The 47-story Salomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has also just collapsed. And part of the Defense Department, the Pentagon near Washington, continues to burn after another hijacked airliner plunged into it. The mayor of New York has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. There are no indications so far of who's behind the attacks. President Bush said those responsible would be hunted down. Our correspondent Mike Wooldridge has been following the day's events.
America's vulnerability to terrorism has never been exposed like this. The second hijacked plane flies into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center and a fireball erupts around the 110-story building. The other tower was already ablaze after being hit by another plane only minutes earlier.
Oh my God!
One plane and one tower might just have been a terrible accident. That possibility was blown apart with the second direct hit. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 bombing of this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world, but this was to be infinitely more audacious. Some of those trapped inside went to desperate lengths in the hope of rescue. The same desperation led others to jump to an inevitable death. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center as the authorities tried to marshal people away from the area.
What's happening?
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Within the hour, one of the huge towers constructed to withstand all but the most apocalyptic of events collapsed.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
The attack was too devastating for the second tower as well, and not long after, it too collapsed, filling the streets with yet more debris and dust. Thousands worked in these towers. No one had any idea how many casualties there were, but that they were mounting horrifically was obvious. The mayor of New York predicted that the death toll would be tremendous and ordered the evacuation of South Manhattan. Its streets took on an eerie appearance now as stunned people tried to make their way to safety. But the terrorists, it seems, had other designs. The very heart of the US defense establishment was another of their targets. A third hijacked plane came down in a steep descent over Washington and crashed into the side of the Pentagon, setting off another huge blaze. Apparently, the evacuation of the building had been ordered a few minutes before, but had barely started. A fourth airliner came down in Pennsylvania, some 80 miles from Pittsburgh. This was the scene at the aftermath of that crash. By now, Americans were starting to portray it as the worst attack on their country since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
In the space of a few hours, the landscape of New York had been changed in an apparently coordinated attack that could barely have been imagined.
Reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have come from leaders around the world. Geeta Gurumurthy has this report.
Housing one of America's key enemies, the Taliban regime has denied Osama bin Laden was the man behind today's horrific events. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan condemned what he called the terrorist attacks and said they don't allow bin Laden to use the asylum of Afghanistan against any country. If it's not bin Laden, there's speculation it could be a new deadly mix of disaffected Islamic groups. Today, the UN Secretary General said the world is traumatized.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
From the Middle East to Asia and Europe, world leaders have joined in condemnation. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said his people felt the pain of the Americans. He said today had proved the need for Russian plans for an international fight against terrorism. Britain, too, joined in the call for mass condemnation against an attack of mass terrorism.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
NATO called an emergency meeting. Armed forces are on alert, but it's still not known who carried out this atrocity.
The Americans don't know, we don't know, but the clear message to whoever it was is that they will have left a trail behind them, and they can be assured that they will be found. And the international community, the whole international community, will be united in condemning what they've done and making sure that they're not in a position to do it again.
Governments everywhere are dazed by the destruction. From Iran, Syria, China, Ghana, words of condemnation. And from Cuba and South Africa, offers of humanitarian aid. And whilst the Bush administration may have incurred increasing wrath, especially in the Muslim world, the question remains, if America is this vulnerable, is anyone safe? Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, much earlier today because of, of course, the dreadful collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. But New York, very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working properly, the subway lines are not working properly, and we know that down there near the World Trade Center there are 3 schools that are being turned into triage centers for emergency treatment. And I know that over in New York Harbor, where the famous Statue of Liberty is, there's a field hospital where 1,500 people are being treated, and we have heard, though it's unconfirmed as yet, that 100 New York City police officers have been taken there as well for treatment. But we do need to confirm those figures for the officers.
It's now, some 8 hours since the attacks. Is there any estimate yet available of the number of casualties in the World Trade Center?
I think we can only go at this point with the words expressed by the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, that it's too frightening to think how many there could be. We know that it's about almost 300 people on the airliners that were used in these attacks. But you've got to remember, this was 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday morning. It's busy in downtown Manhattan in the financial district then. The World Trade Center itself has 50,000 workers. There are tens of thousands of tourists who go up there every day. The figures are almost too frightening to contemplate. You can understand why nobody yet wants to put a figure on them.
Listening to the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, a bit earlier, one of his messages was, business as usual. We won't let this get us down. But presumably, a lot of Manhattan people must have fled the city to Long Island to get away from impossible.
You have to remember, even now, I don't think people can it can sink in to people what's happened.
We haven't, for the past hour or so, heard much from the people of Manhattan. You're with them there. I mean, what are they saying tonight after this catastrophic attack?
As I said, many just cannot believe this has happened. And I've seen, big burly men and women with tears in their eyes today, shaking their heads, wondering what on earth is going on. There was a sense of panic. Our reports from the scene were of people just absolutely horrified. And I've already seen some photographs of that a man took down in the downtown area, and it looks like the aftermath of a huge atom bomb or something, just full of debris and of like a white carpeting of snow from all the dust and rubbish that had fallen. I don't think people can comprehend. They certainly have lost any feeling of safety. There's still a great pride in the city. People are determined to fight back, but a great sense of shock and loss. People keep looking at the sky, for example, where you can see the plume of smoke, and say, when that's gone, it won't be there anymore. Our Twin Towers won't be there. Such a symbol of New York.
Are they talking yet about revenge and what the government should do to counter this threat, or are they numbed still?
I think people are still numb, and I don't think people are talking about revenge in that way at all yet. I think people are still too traumatized. We don't know how many people have been killed. We can't even put a figure. I think when you talk to people on they daren't even say how many people might have been killed and injured. And I think that feeling, until the idea of the devastation, people don't really know what to say or what to think. I think they feel the bubble of their security as being in America has definitely been popped. This city and this country will not be the same. But they don't really know where to turn. That's the very sad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of very, very traumatized people that has hit them very, very hard.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can rejoin her and follow that up later. Across America, citizens are trying to come to grips with the enormity of what has happened. As our correspondent Tom Carver reports, it'll be days before the country returns to anything resembling normal life.
The American Airlines plane slammed into the ground floor of the Pentagon. It was less than an hour after the World Trade Center attack. All 6 stories of the building on one side were destroyed, leaving a massive hole in the military headquarters of the world's superpower. Stunned 3-star generals and clerks were herded into surrounding car parks, which were turned into emergency medical centers. The Air Force was activated to shoot down any other plane which came close. This is the first attack on the Pentagon in American history.
You could tell it was like a suicide bomber, but I'm not saying there was a bomb, but it was a plane. And it just came streaking down and hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
A quarter of an hour later, a 757 crashed into a field close to Camp David, the president's rural retreat. The president himself was hundreds of miles away in Florida, about to talk to some school children, when his chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered the news to him. Minutes later, he was boarding Air Force One. Instead of returning to Washington, he went to an Air Force base in Louisiana.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people.
Washington itself has been virtually sealed off from the outside world. Every federal office has been closed, thousands of workers sent home. Even Congress has been evacuated and shut.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country. And I gathered my staff and we calmly held a prayer meeting, and then I told them to go home.
Across the country, banks and schools have been ordered to close. Inner cities are deserted. Many parts of the country have declared states of emergency. There is no air traffic over America at present. All planes have been ordered to land at the nearest airport. A nationwide appeal for blood has gone out. In several cities, the phone networks have been frozen. Here on the eastern seaboard, the motorways are clogged with traffic. If it was the terrorists' intention to sow confusion and panic in America, at least on this day, it would seem they succeeded. Tom Carver, BBC News, Washington.
I'm joined now by Don Morrison, the European editor of Time magazine. Welcome. Don, for a moment, just take your journalist hat off and tell me what it's like being an American on a day like today.
It's difficult to generalize about a nation of 250 million people, except perhaps at a moment like this, of great national trauma, a presidential assassination, the Challenger space shuttle disaster, Pearl Harbor. Americans, as your correspondent in New York said, are shocked, not yet angry. In their hearts, the motivation of a terrorist, whether he's from the Middle East or the Japanese Red Army, as somebody on the wires has speculated, to try to do harm to a country that they think wants only to do good in this world. So as a result, they cannot make a connection between America's policies in, for instance, the Middle East and terrorist acts on their own soil. One other generalization. Americans have a tendency to personalize foreign policy. Hence the rush to judgment that it was Osama bin Laden who was behind this. For all we know, this is true, but we don't have the evidence yet.
And remember Oklahoma City.
Remember Oklahoma City, which was initially blamed on Osama bin Laden and other suspects. So there's a tendency to view the world as individuals who are out to do us harm, not as movements, differing opinions, impersonal forces arrayed in opposition to what the United States stands for.
Now, America desperately needs political leadership, doesn't it? Is George Bush the man for the moment?
You've put your finger on something that's at the dark heart of America's insecurity right now. You'll find very few Americans who will say this, but I think there's a bit of concern that we have a young, a new and relatively untested novice president. Of course, the same thing happened to John F. Kennedy when the Cuban Missile Crisis, his big test. You heard the same kinds of concerns expressed sotto voce. I think you'll start to hear those as well. Another concern is that Bush, who tends to be something of, or rather whose administration tends to be unilateralist, they've been accused of being, could overreact.
What does he need to do now domestically? I mean, obviously they're going to try their best to find the perpetrators and punish them and get them. How long, how patient will American opinion be for that?
His options in finding and punishing the perpetrators are limited. He has more options and perhaps a more pressing task right now in reassuring the American people, in restoring the confidence that's going to be lost as a result of this tragedy. This is a financial tragedy as well, a human tragedy, a blow to a self-confident, formerly self-confident nation's self-confidence already shaken by the recession.
Indeed, you mentioned the financial side, and we haven't really touched on it because we're dealing with so many lost lives here, aren't we? But is this going to be something, do you think, that, I mean, business confidence was already fragile. Could it tip America into a recession, rather like happened in the early 1990s with the Gulf War?
It's certainly not going to help. Billions, hundreds perhaps of billions of dollars will be lost. Insurance, suspension of trading on major stock exchanges for 2 days. Stock prices will surely plunge when trading does resume. Yes, oil prices will probably skyrocket. This certainly isn't going to help an already dreadful economic picture in the U.S.
And it's going to change, surely, the culture of America's way of life, isn't it? The idea of popping over to an airport and jumping on a plane and flying across the country with very few restrictions, this is going to have to change, isn't it? There's going to have to be more of a culture about security and awareness.
We went through this before with previous terrorist attacks. There have been waves of security tightened at airports and the like. That's going to be ratcheted way up. Americans will start to feel a loss of innocence as they lose some of their daily freedoms.
And what about America's defense machine? I mean, the world's only superpower now. Billions spent on defense, and yet America looks vulnerable. And as you've just said, the American people, to some extent, naive about the threat now facing them.
Well, I'm not a defense analyst, but I think quite a few of them have come on the air here and elsewhere saying that these are the kinds of threats that are very difficult to guard against. A missile defense system is not going to do you much good here. Your best defense is probably good intelligence, and in this case, we had an intelligence failure.
Don, thanks very much for talking to us here on BBC World. Thank you. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister, Shimon Peres. He was in Jerusalem, and he gave me his reaction to today's shocking and bewildering events.
You know, it's like a Pearl Harbor, like a new form of a war, or like a terrible new arm, and we have to take it very seriously. Our hearts is clearly with the people of the United States, but this was not an attack just upon America. It was an attack upon civilization, upon humanity, an attempt to introduce the jungle as the rule of our time and our days. And I think we have to take it very seriously. We are going over from a world of enemies and armies to a world of dangers of a global nature without strategies and without organizations. We have to get ourselves organized. Now, as we feel so deeply with the United States, we know that the United States is determined and strong and will take again the lead to guarantee freedom, to enable people to fly safely, to walk in the streets unthreatened, and really to bring us back to normal life.
Now, as a country, Israel has often been on the receiving end of attacks, although nothing as spectacular as this. What sort of advice would you give to Washington?
To organize it globally in both directions, to identify every country that hosts or supports terror or terrorism, to stop it, otherwise they will be declared as a country of terror with all the consequences. Secondly, to call upon all leaders of religion and culture to stand up and declare themselves against this phenomena of suicidal terror, because it's becoming one of the greatest dangers of our time. It goes against the gospel, and the clergymen have to call each in his own religion to put an end to it.
One final question, Mr. Perez. Many people suspect a Middle East dimension to these attacks. Do you think there's a possibility that American public opinion might want to disengage from the Middle East because they see it as too risky now for America?
I don't think it has to do with the region. It has to do with the form of confrontation and war. There were acts of terror in the United States disconnected with the Middle East, and there are terror in many other places all over the world, including Turkey, including Algeria, including Pakistan. And we have to get ourselves organized not to let small mafias of killers, of cheaters, of liars to disturb life.
Shimon Peres. We're going now live to Islamabad, where our World Affairs editor John Simpson is. John, many fingers in the West are pointing at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan for this. I know the Taliban have an office in Islamabad. What are they saying?
Well, the Taliban government, in fact, in Afghanistan itself has denied very firmly that there's any kind of link between Osama bin Laden and this attack. But of course, they want to be they want to avoid, if they possibly can, any possibility of the Americans attacking Afghanistan again. And so it's natural, I suppose, for them to distance themselves from him as much as they can. He is, after all, their guest, not perhaps all that willing on their part to be his hosts. And they, I think, are very anxious indeed to try to forestall any possibility that the Americans will attack. But having said that, I don't think there's probably very much doubt in the minds of many people here that Osama bin Laden was in fact responsible.
Tell us a bit about Osama bin Laden. What sort of resources in manpower and money he's got and what he's trying to achieve?
Well, when I was in Afghanistan just a couple of days ago, I heard that he had about 2,000 volunteers working in his camps, being trained, most of them Arabs, and indeed people were saying there were more Arabs than usual in Kabul, for instance, where I was, than you know, in the normal run of things. Those volunteers are trained extremely highly in weaponry and so forth, in communications, and the best ones are selected for particular operations. And they are then issued with passports, not very difficult to get false passports or stolen passports here, and sent out along the lines of the, frankly, of the people smugglers who've been smuggling people from Afghanistan around the world.
Now, in the past, America, of course, have tried to attack Osama bin Laden by sending in cruise missiles. Some defense analysts are even speculating that they could send troops on the ground. Is that realistic, do you think, from your vantage point?
Well, I don't think it's a very sensible thing, frankly. After all, a lot of people have sent troops into Afghanistan and have regretted it afterwards. I don't think we